Hello, and welcome to Williams Mullen's Trending Now, an IP podcast, a legal podcast focused on providing innovative companies and investors with important and timely information concerning intangible assets, such as patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. I'm your host, Rob Van Arnam, and today I'll be joined by my colleague, Ed White, a partner in our IP section who handles matters related to trademarks, branding, and advertising. And he's here to discuss false and misleading advertising with a focus on label review. Ed, how are you today?
Good, Rob. I'm doing well. Thank you.
How are you? Well, I'm doing fine. I'm glad to have you with us. Maybe as a starting place, can you give our listeners a baseline on the laws that define and govern false and misleading advertising?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think, to start, it might be helpful for our listeners to also have a baseline as far as what we're talking about. So when we're asking ourselves, what is false and misleading advertising? Essentially, what we're talking about is the act of using deceptive or misleading or false statements or representations about a product or service in an advertisement or on a product label. And when a business makes a claim or a representation like that, and they create a false impression in consumers regarding, let's say, the price or the value or the quantity or quality of the goods and services, then that business is likely to be liable for false and misleading advertising. And it's worth noting that the laws for false and misleading advertising apply to these businesses, even if no one has suffered an actual loss or damage. So it's important for our listeners to be thinking about this. So there's really several areas of the law where this comes into play. And at the federal level, it's really two main bodies that include the Lanham Act and the Federal Trade Commission's Truth in Advertising Act. So under the Lanham Act, which some people will recognize as the Trademark Act, there's also an unfair competition, unfair trade practices component to that, and it's Section 43A. And essentially it says that a plaintiff can bring a claim against a defendant for false advertising. And if they do that, the plaintiff has to prove that the defendant made false or misleading statements regarding the defendant's products and services, or for that matter, a third party's products or services, that a substantial portion of the intended consumers were deceived or were likely to be deceived, that the deception was material and that it was likely to influence these purchasing decisions, and that the advertised goods and services were offered in interstate commerce, which obviously is a big component of the Lanham Act. And then finally, as a result, there was a likelihood of injury to the plaintiff. It's worth noting that under the Lanham Act, the plaintiff doesn't have to actually prove injury, but as long as the plaintiff proves those elements we just discussed, they have a viable cause of action for false advertising under the Lanham Act. So that brings us to the FTC. The FTC's Truth in Advertising Act is really based on all consumers. And the FTC is very concerned about protecting those consumers and preventing deceptive and unfair acts or practices. So not surprisingly, the FTC is particularly concerned about deceptive and unfair trade practices when it comes to medicines or products that are ingested by a consumer. Obviously, those can be very harmful. And under the Truth in Advertising Act, an advertisement is deemed deceptive if it contains a statement or if it omits information that's likely to mislead consumers acting reasonably under the circumstances, and that is material and that it is important to the consumer's decision to buy or use the product. An advertisement or business practice is unfair under the Act if it causes or is likely to cause substantial consumer injury, which a consumer could not reasonably avoid, and it is not outweighed by the benefit to the consumers. So those are really the two federal bodies of law we're talking about.
Got it. Interesting. Well, that's helpful. Now, you covered federal. What about state laws? Are those applicable as well?
They are, Rob. That's a great point you brought up. Often, in most cases, I think almost all states have what we call unfair competition and deceptive advertising laws in place. Oftentimes, you'll hear people refer to these as little FTC acts because they mirror, in many cases, the FTC Truth in Advertising Act. Because there's so many of them out there, I'll use Virginia because that's where I am as an example. Virginia Code Section 59.1-200 actually identifies over 65 fraudulent acts or practices that are declared unlawful when they're committed by a supplier in connection with a consumer transaction. And obviously, I won't waste our time listing all 65, but there's a few that will, I think, ring true. So, for example, suppliers in Virginia cannot misrepresent that goods or services are those of another entity. They can't misrepresent the source or sponsorship or approval, or for that matter, the certification of goods and services. They also can't misrepresent that there's an affiliation or connection or an association of the supplier with another entity. And so these are just a handful of things that they cannot misrepresent in their advertising in Virginia. And you'll find that most state laws run parallel to the Virginia law.
Got it. Well, that's helpful. Now, can you give us some examples of the types of statements that have been found to be false and maybe how they're distinguished from a statement that is not actionable?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to kind of categorize these. I'm going to put these into some buckets because these are easy examples in that regard. So one bucket or one category would be the unsubstantiated claim. And this occurs when a company claims that their product will provide specific benefits to users, but these benefits really haven't been officially proven. So oftentimes you'll see this as an example on advertisements with regard to holistic or non-pharmaceutical health companies. They'll have a product that they'll say is all natural, that the all natural supplement helps to resolve or cure a specific illness. But in most cases, there's no medical studies or data to validate those claims. So in the past, several companies have been ordered to cease these types of advertisements or to state that the claims are not supported by the FDA, and that's come under the FTC Act. Another example or another bucket would be the misleading photo or illustration. As you know, photos can be adapted and altered very easily nowadays through programs like Photoshop. And one example that has come up in the past was a company that was selling car wax. They actually put out some photos of the car wax after it had been, purportedly placed on the vehicle, but they had altered the photos to provide a deeper or richer color. And in that case, the company was ordered to obviously refrain from using that photo or to make clear to consumers that the photo was not an actual true resolution of the wax. There's also another bucket I would call comparison inconsistencies. And as you probably know, companies love to make comparative advertising claims. Obviously, they always want to try to make sure that their product is seen as more favorable than a competitor's product. And usually those claims revolve around the efficacy of the product. And in some cases, a company might highlight that qualities of their product are superior to the qualities of a competing product. But what they won't do then is come back and say that there are actually superior qualities in the competing product or qualities in the competing product that are superior to qualities in their own. And that alone will make it an unfair trade practice. And so you have to be very careful when you're making those comparative advertising claims. And then the last bucket that I'll just touch on is sort of the price deception and bait and switch. Some examples of that would be, for example, a clothing store that might say, we'll offer you one suit at full price and one suit free. But in reality, when you add those two suits together and the total cost for those two suits, you'll find that the total price being advertised was really no more than they would have offered for those suits individually in the past in any event. So they're really not offering you a deal at all. Another example of that might be where they draw in a consumer by telling the consumer that they have a product at a very, very low price. But then, of course, the consumer arrives in the store and they find that there were either a very limited quantity of those products, or there were no products like that to begin with. And so what they're really being offered is a product at a higher price. So those are the price deception and bait and switch examples. And those are the ones that are really actionable. Something, you asked about non-actionable. Something that's non-actionable would be considered puffery. Now, puffery is really a subjective statement. It's when a company promotes a product or service through hyperbole or an oversized statement about the quality of the product. And that statement really can't be objectively verified. That's puffery at the end of the day. And so, for example, a statement that relays that 80% of all pickup trucks sold in the US are Ford brand trucks, well, that would be verifiable, and that could be deemed false advertising if it's incorrect. Whereas if Ford put out a statement that the Ford pickup is America's favorite, well, that's far more objective, and therefore the statement is likely considered non-actionable puffery. So again, when you're looking at puffery, which is non-actionable, we're looking at that hyperbolic statement that's subjective versus one that's objective and verifiable. So those are just some examples.
Well, that's really helpful. Do you have any sort of takeaways on labeling that some of the companies and listeners might follow? Some of the things they should do or not do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thematically, the key is really to consider every statement that you place on a product label. And if the statement is literally true and it can be corroborated with generally accepted statistics or studies, then you're likely fine. But if the statement is true but potentially misleading, well, then you're in a grayer area, and companies need to reevaluate those statements before placing them on labels. And finally, I guess it's axiomatic that if a company puts a false statement on a label, and it's demonstrably false and objectively false, well, then they're certainly potentially liable, and they need to be, concerned about that.
Great. Well, maybe real quickly at the end, I will just throw in some recent matters related to litigation and enforcement. You mentioned the FTC. Some things we've seen recently have been their added enforcement. As you mentioned, they go after certain claims affecting consumers. We've seen a lot of made in the USA claims. And to meet that, you have to have all or virtually all of the product made in the USA. That's one. Some new recent FTC action is with regard to native advertising, which is when a company may purport to be kind of an independent reviewer of something, but when in fact they've got a relationship or the company itself, they find that deceptive without clear disclosure. And another one, the FTC commissioner just came out with a talk on dark patterns, which is essentially hidden prices or misdirection or confusing language in a website that steers people in a direction to make choices that they otherwise wouldn't. And it's sort of impossible to escape a lot of hidden fees or added costs. And then, sort of in the private area, you've got the Lanham Act, Ed, as you mentioned. There's a lot of action there. One thing that people, I think, forget is that it used to be that you had to be a competitor of the defendant company to have standing to bring a suit. That's no longer the case. Anyone who has been affected by it can bring a case. The other thing that people forget is sort of a newer phenomenon is contributory false advertising. When you've got more than one party that is aiding and abetting essentially in the false advertising, they can be liable as well. And of course, we've seen state action and some of the state laws you mentioned. One thing that comes up a bunch is preemption. So when does federal law like the FDA govern a matter so extensively that the claim that a plaintiff is trying to bring is preempted by that federal statute? And that's often a case and matter that's litigated. So a lot of activity in this space, and folks should pay attention to it. It's maybe easier said than done when you're coming up with advertising programs to stay compliant, stay away from the FTC and competitor suits. Well, thank you, Ed. That will wrap up our discussion on false and misleading advertising with a focus on label review. I'd like to thank Ed White again for joining me on Trending Now, an IP podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us. You can also visit our intellectual property practice page at williamsmullen.com/IP. There you can find out more about our team, as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.